like Jesse said, I am Anthony Paul, and thank you very much for inviting me to this event, Jesse. I'm really pleased to be here, and thanks for coming too. I work for this organization here that's called Resources for the Future. We go by RFF, and my organization is a nonprofit think tank. We're non-advocacy, non-partisan, bunch of PhD economists, basically, and we sort of try to span the worlds of policy analysis and research and academia. And the outlet for most of our work is academic journals. And just trying to make the point that I'm not an advocate. I'm not an environmentalist, nor am I a skeptic. I'm a scholar. First slide, please. So the point here is that I'm here to tell you about what I think are going to be the impacts of the Waxman-Markey bill if it were to become law. And I would like to start the impacts on Indiana, of course, and I would like to start with these two quotes here, which sort of set the tone for what folks in Indiana think about the impacts on Indiana from Waxman-Markey. You know, the point is that it's going to be brutal economically, is the message here. So I'm going to take it apart a little bit and tell you what I think. Okay, so here are some statistics to start out with, and I think these numbers, I think, feed the notion that was on this first slide about how painful a bill like this will be for Indiana. First of all, coal is the most carbon-intensive fuel of all, and Indiana's electricity generation is done almost entirely with coal, so that certainly might lead to big economic impact from the bill. And secondly, largely because coal is the primary fuel for electricity generation, electricity prices here are very low, and so electricity consumption here is relatively high. But I like this third bullet first. The governor's statement about how electricity prices would double, I would just like to make the point that even if they did double, Indiana would still have only the 10th most expensive electricity prices in the country. And these last two bullets here are also indicative of how this could be a painful bill for Indiana, in that Indiana is quite electricity consumption intensive and also quite CO2 emissions intensive. Okay, so Tony just told you about the allocation schemes that are in the Waxman-Markey bill, and they are really important to the outcomes that are likely to emerge. And there's one part of it in particular that is the allocation to electricity local distribution companies. Tony had put it on his slide as 32% in 2014. By 2016, this amounts to 30% of the allocation, and it persists that way until all of these allocations phase out in 2030. So basically what we're talking about here is 30% of the total allowance pie will be allocated to local distribution companies over the next couple decades. And so let's go through these bullets here. The first point is that the point of the allocation scheme is to mitigate costs. I mean, the textbook economist in me says that the right thing to do with all these allowances is put them in the Treasury and lower our income tax rates. But that's not a politically viable solution. So the idea with the allocation is to mitigate the cost of the program. And that is precisely the idea of this local distribution company allocation. Right, okay, so the point is local distribution companies are the companies that retail electricity, such as Duke Energy. And they are regulated nationwide. There are almost no electricity consumers that face a competitive market for electricity. So there are regulators, mostly state public utility commissions, who set electricity prices. So the feds are able to make a rule that says we're going to give value to the local distribution companies, and the state PUCs can then enforce that value is passed through to the customers. And so that's the point here about the bullet. 30% of the allowances will be, on January 1st each year, let's say, when the federal government prints the allowances, they'll take 30% of them and mail them out to the local distribution companies, who will then have to lower electricity prices for their customers based on the value that they get in these allowances. And one of the really key features of this local distribution company allocation is the formula that's used to determine how much each local distribution company gets. because there are, I forgot how many thousands of them around the country. And the Waxman-Markey bill has a formula in it that uses a 50-50 weighting of historical electricity consumption and historical carbon emissions to determine the distribution. The historical period, I think, is 2005, 6, or something like that, pretty recent historical. So the idea is that the calculation will be made of consumption at each LDC and emissions at each LDC. And then the average of those two numbers becomes the metric that is used to determine the distribution. You know, how many allowances actually go to each one of the LDCs. And by this formula, Indiana does great because it's a consumption-intensive state and it's an emissions-intensive state. And really the whole point of this part of the allocation, this 30%, the whole point of it is to bring regional equity to the bill because it's acknowledged by, I mean, it's well understood that the impacts of this bill will not be uniform across the country. I mean, places like Indiana that are so coal intensive are likely to feel greater impact. And so they put together this formula specifically to even out the regional impacts of the bill. And lo and behold, this weighting will bring, well, so the point here is that Indiana is going to get the second most number of allowances of any state. Now, actually, it's a long story. Don't put too much stock in that number, but I think it's second most. And I think that this is the key provision of this bill for Indiana. So basically, the rest of my slides, I'm going to tell you about the electricity price impacts of Waxman-Markey, and in particular, the electricity price reduction that's going to result from this allocation. Go ahead. Okay, I'm going to zoom through these next two slides, but the point is that there is a model, mathematical economic model called Haiku electricity market model that it was constructed initially about 10 years ago at RFF by myself and two of my colleagues, and it's still maintained there. And it's a lot like the model that the Department of Energy uses to study energy sector stuff, except that it's just an electricity sector model. It doesn't cover any of the rest of the economy. So this is what it does, but let's skip it for now. Go ahead. And these are the regions in the model, and it's convenient that Indiana, the state of Indiana, is a region unto itself in the model. I didn't do that specifically for this talk. It's just lucky that I was able to go look at our modeling results and get Indiana-specific results. So that's what I'm going to do altogether. Oh, okay, go ahead. Okay, so here's a first kind of high-level look at what Waxman-Markey is going to mean. And this is, so this figure here is over time, starting in 2012 is when the policy would start, and out through 2030 is as far as my model goes. And this is showing the various parts of emissions and reductions and where they're going to come from. And this is mainly what I'm going to talk about here on this slide is the impact of the offsets that Tony was mentioning. He said that there was a generous allocation. It is a really generous allocation. And so what this figure shows is, first of all, that the total amount of emissions, carbon emissions that are likely to emerge from this bill is the amount that's at the top of the gray line, where the bottom part, the red part is international offsets. The point is that the cap that reduces our emissions to 80% by 2050 doesn't actually reduce our emissions to 80% by 2050 because we can go over the cap if we buy offsets. And there are 2 billion tons of offsets allowed in the bill. And so the black line is the cap. But we're going to be over the cap because we can buy offsets. And in fact, the amount of emissions that are going to occur is the top of the gray line, where the gray itself is actually uncovered emissions. The agricultural sector isn't covered in this bill, and small producers of emissions are also not covered. And the amount of uncovered emissions is really quite large. It's the gray part. And then up on top there, the orange and the purple are the actual electricity or emissions reductions that are projected under this bill. And one of the shocking things I think about this is that this bill will induce more reductions abroad. The red part there amounts to reductions abroad. This bill will induce more reductions abroad than it will induce here at home. Now, carbon is a global kind of pollutant, so that's perfectly fine from the perspective of the atmosphere, but it's sort of an interesting feature.